Josephine didn't see a businessman or a stranger. She saw a man who moved like the city itself was afraid of him, and she grabbed his tattooed arm with a grip born of pure desperation. "My brother, they took him in that truck," she screamed, pointing at a matte black shadow disappearing into the Manhattan rain. Thales Rios looked at her with eyes like a locked door, and for one heartbeat, the most dangerous man in the city had to decide if he was a predator or a savior. If this story pulled you in, go ahead and subscribe so you never miss what's ahead. I've got another unforgettable story coming tomorrow. And while you're here, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I love seeing people tuned in from all over the world. Okay, let's get back into it. Nobody stopped for her. Not the businessman in the charcoal overcoat who glanced down, kept walking, and pulled his phone from his pocket, like the sight of a crying child was just another Manhattan inconvenience. Not the woman in scrubs who said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart," without breaking stride. Not the food cart vendor who waved her off with a rag and turned back to his steam tray. 3 adults, 4 minutes, one truck getting further away with every second Josephine Harrison spent begging strangers for help. She was 10 years old. She was soaking wet. And she was completely, terrifyingly out of options. That was when she saw him. He stood beside a black luxury sedan, idling at the curb tall, in the particular way that reorganized the space around him, like the city had quietly agreed to give him more room than everyone else. Black suit, tailored clean, collar open, no tie. Dark ink climbed the column of his neck in patterns that disappeared beneath his cuffs and reappeared across his knuckles. His hair was slicked back against his skull, not a strand displaced despite the rain. His face was still. Not relaxed still, the way a locked door is still. One hand rested on the open driver's door. He was a second, maybe 2, from folding himself inside and disappearing into traffic. Josephine ran. She didn't think about who he was. She didn't think about the way people on the sidewalk gave him a 6-foot radius without being asked, or the way the 2 men behind him stood at angles that said bodyguard to anyone paying attention. She didn't think about any of it. She thought about Caleb. She grabbed his arm with both hands and held on. He turned sharply, not startled, but precise, the way a man turns when he's spent decades treating unexpected contact as a threat assessment. His eyes dropped to her. Dark eyes. Unreadable. They moved across her face the way a reader moves across a page fast, absorbing everything, giving nothing back. "My brother." Her voice cracked. "They took him. He's in that truck. Please, please, you have to..." She pointed down Lexington Avenue with a trembling arm. The matte black cargo truck was already 2 blocks out, no company logo on the side. One cracked taillight pulsing like a half-dead ember in the gray October rain. Moving steadily. Not speeding, that was the thing that made her stomach drop every time she thought about it. It was moving like it had nowhere urgent to be, because it didn't need to rush, because nobody was coming for it. The man looked at it, 1 second, maybe less. Then he looked back at her. His expression didn't change, not exactly, but something behind his eyes did. A door opened that she didn't have a name for. He had spent 20 years in the company of people who lied to him, beautifully, professionally, desperately. He knew what manipulation looked like when it wore a child's face. He knew what a staged scene felt like, what a planted distraction smelled like. He had survived this long precisely because he trusted none of it by default, but there was no performance here. No calculation in those red-rimmed eyes. Just a child in free fall, losing her grip on something she could still see but not reach, and she was reaching for him because there was nothing else left to reach for. He recognized that. He had been that, once. He shut the car door. "Tell me everything," he said. Fast. Her name was Josephine Harrison. Her brother was Caleb, 12 years old, brown coat, blue backpack with a broken zipper on the left pocket. They had been walking home from school on 68th, when a man near a delivery entrance grabbed Caleb by the collar and dragged him into the alley before she could even process what she was seeing. She screamed. The man turned, looked at her once, and didn't run. He just walked fast, controlled around the corner where the truck was waiting with its rear doors already open. She saw Caleb shoved inside. She saw the doors close. She saw the truck pull out and turn onto Lexington. And then she ran not after the truck, because she was 10 and she wasn't stupid, but toward people, toward adults, toward anyone who might have the size and the authority and the will to do something she couldn't. 3 adults, 4 minutes. "The back door," she said, her breath coming in short, hard pulls. "There's a scratch on it, long one, and the company logo on the side, it's been painted over. You can still see the outline if the light hits it right, and the right taillight is cracked. He looked at her steadily. What color was the man's jacket? Dark green. He had a radio on his belt. Not a phone, a radio. Thales Rios had been doing this long enough to know that liars overcomplicated. They added color and emotion, and they watched your face while they talked. What they didn't do was memorize cracked taillights and painted over logos and the difference between a radio and a phone. He pulled out his phone, made one call. 4 words. Black cargo truck, Lexington. The response came in under 30 seconds. His man on the east side had flagged 3 vehicles matching that description. In the last 6 weeks, all of them spotted near reported missing children cases in Queens and Brooklyn. All of them ghost-plated. All of them moving during evening commute hours when traffic provided the best cover. This was not a random grab. This was a pipeline. And it was operating inside his city, inside his territory, with the kind of confidence that only came from believing no one was watching. Thales opened the passenger door. Get in. Josephine didn't hesitate. She climbed in, pulling the seatbelt across her chest with shaking hands. He rounded the car, settled into the driver's seat, and turned the key. The engine came alive, low, controlled, like everything else about him. He didn't tell her it would be all right. He didn't offer her comfort or softened words or the kind of reassurances adults use to manage children when they didn't know what else to give them. He just pulled into traffic and said, "Point me in the direction it turned." And for the first time in 4 minutes, Josephine Harrison exhaled. The hunt had begun. She pointed left at the intersection of 68th. Thales took it without braking. The sedan moved through the gap in traffic, with the kind of precision that came from knowing exactly how much space an engine had to work with. Not reckless, not showy, just efficient in the way that expensive machinery operated when the person controlling it had stopped being impressed by it years ago. Josephine sat rigid in the passenger seat, both hands pressed flat against her thighs. Her gray hoodie was still soaking. She hadn't noticed. She was watching the road ahead the way a person watches for something they're terrified of seeing and equally terrified of not seeing. "Talk," Thales said, not unkindly, but without room for silence. Everything from the beginning. She talked. They had left school at 3:40. Caleb always walked with her, had done it every day since their mother started the second job in September, the one that kept her at the hospital until 7 most evenings. It was their routine. Caleb carried both backpacks on the longer blocks because Josephine's left shoulder had been sore since a fall in gym class. He complained about it every single time, and every single time he did it anyway. He used to say I owed him, she said quietly. Like weekly. He kept a running total. She almost smiled. It lasted half a second. We were on 68th, near the parking garage. There's a delivery entrance on the left side trucks. Use it for the restaurant supply place. Caleb was ahead of me by maybe 4 steps because I stopped to fix my shoe. She stopped. Thales didn't fill the silence. I looked up, and there was a man beside him. I didn't even see him come from anywhere. He was there. He had Caleb by the back of the collar, and he was walking him toward the alley like it was nothing. Like Caleb was luggage. Her jaw tightened. Caleb looked back at me. She said it the way people say the things they can't stop seeing when they close their eyes. He didn't scream. He just looked at me, and I think he was trying not to scare me. Even then. Even while it was happening. Thales' hand shifted slightly on the wheel. Not enough for her to notice. I screamed, she continued. The man looked at me once, and then he just kept walking. Around the corner, to where the truck was. The doors were already open, like they'd been waiting, like this was planned. That word landed in the car like something heavy. Planned. Thales made a second call. His lieutenant, Reza, picked up before the second ring. The truck from Lexington crossed it against the Queens cases from last month, and the 2 from Brooklyn in August. Vehicle profile, timing, route patterns. A pause. Keyboard sounds in the background. It matches, Reza said. Same operation. We've been watching it build for 6 weeks. They've been moving through the borough lines, staying just outside anyone's direct jurisdiction. Smart routing. Whose is it? Another pause. Shorter this time. Ferreira's people. The faction that's been pushing north. Thales said nothing for 3 seconds. Ferreira. A name that belonged to a man who had spent the better part of a year testing boundaries. Small encroachments, quiet expansions, probing for weakness the way water probed for cracks in concrete. Thales had noted it, tracked it, filed it away as something that would require a response eventually. He hadn't anticipated this. Not children. Not inside his territory. Not with this kind of organizational structure running in plain sight while his network watched the wrong edges. Where's the truck routing? FDR southbound if they want the tunnel. Industrial corridor near the river if they want to hold until transfer. Transfer to what? We think a secondary vehicle. Maybe two. The pattern in the other cases, the cargo truck is never the final move. It's the collection point. Thales ended the call. He accelerated through an amber light, smooth and deliberate, and Josephine gripped the door handle without saying anything. She was learning the rhythm of him that speed in this car didn't mean panic. It meant decision. Was he holding your hand? Thales asked, before the man grabbed him. She hesitated. No, she said. He was ahead of me. I stopped to fix my shoe, and he kept walking, and she stopped. I let go, she whispered, of his sleeve. I had his sleeve and I let go to fix my shoe and then, the sentence didn't finish. It didn't need to. The guilt sat in the car between them, taking up space, refusing to be reasoned away by logic or timing, or the fact that none of it, not a single second of it, was her fault. She was 10. She had stopped to fix her shoe. These were not the actions of someone who failed their brother, but guilt never asked for facts. Guilt just stayed. Thales understood that better than almost anything else in his life. You remembered the tail light, he said. The logo, the radio on his belt, the scratch on the door. She looked at him. You were terrified and you still saw everything. That's not nothing. He said it plainly. No softness layered over it, no performance of comfort. Just a statement of what was true, delivered like he expected her to accept it. She didn't respond right away. Then quietly, is it enough? He looked at the road. What he didn't say, what he kept, inside the locked room. He kept everything that mattered was the memory that had surfaced the moment she said, I let go. A different street, a different city, years ago. A younger brother who had looked back at him from the wrong end of a situation that moved too fast for anyone to rewind. Thales had been too late that day. He had carried it every day since. We're not chasing that truck, he said finally. His voice was level. Certain, we're intercepting it. The distinction mattered. Chasing meant reacting. Intercepting meant he had already decided how this ended. He reached for his phone again. Third call. 2 words this time. Seal the corridor. Josephine looked out at the rain-blurred city streaming past her window. Somewhere ahead, in the back of a matte black truck, with a cracked tail light and a painted-over logo, her brother was waiting for someone to come. She had found the right someone. She just had to hold on long enough to believe it. Thales had built his empire the way most lasting things were built. Not loudly, not quickly, not with the kind of visible violence that attracted attention and invited consequences. He had built it the way a river carved through rock consistently, quietly, and with absolute patience for the long game. 20 years of precise decisions, strategic alliances, and the kind of reputation that didn't require maintenance because it maintained itself. Manhattan's underworld didn't fear Thales Rios because he was cruel. They feared him because he was never wrong. When he said a thing would happen, it happened. When he drew a boundary, it held. When he identified something as his, a block, a route, a network, arrangement, it remained his, because everyone involved understood that the cost of testing that claim was a price no one had ever been willing to pay twice. His territory ran from the Upper East Side down through Midtown's commercial underground, the financial arrangements no bank would touch, the disputes no courthouse would hear, the debts that existed in the space between what was legal and what was necessary. He didn't deal in chaos. Chaos was for men without vision. Thales dealt in structure, in the invisible architecture that kept certain parts of the city functioning without the city ever needing to acknowledge it. He had rules. They were few. They were absolute. Children were not commerce. That wasn't sentiment. That was architecture. The moment you allowed certain lines to be crossed, the moment you permitted the kind of trade that turned human beings into cargo, you collapsed the entire structural logic that kept everything else standing. Thales had watched other organizations rot from that particular compromise, had watched men who thought they were expanding discover they had only accelerated their own unraveling. Ferreira's faction had clearly never studied that history, or they had studied it and decided it didn't apply to them. Both were fatal errors. Josephine had fallen quiet beside him. Not the frightened quiet of before this was something different. Exhausted. The kind of silence that settled over a person when their body had been running on adrenaline for too long, and the adrenaline was finally, reluctantly, beginning to thin. Her head rested against the window. Her breath fogged the glass in slow, uneven intervals. She was still watching the road, still looking for the truck. She hadn't stopped looking for the truck. Thales' phone buzzed. Reza again. Ferreira's been moving north for 8 months. We flagged the pattern neighborhood level. Looked like standard expansion. Loan territory. Collection routes. Nothing that broke the architecture. Clearly we flagged the wrong pattern, Thales said. The trafficking layer was underneath everything else, running parallel. We were watching the surface, and the real operation was 2 levels down. A pause. They were counting on that. How many cases total? Confirmed? 7 boys across Queens and Brooklyn, ages 9 to 13. Different neighborhoods, different school routes. None of them connected on paper. 7. The number settled in the car like a physical weight. 7 families. 7 sets of parents who had spent weeks inside the particular hell of not knowing which was worse than knowing, in its own particular way, because not knowing left the imagination fully operational, and the imagination was never merciful. The truck is their 4th run this month, Reza continued. If the pattern holds, they're aggregating cargo before a bulk transfer. Probably Riverside. Probably tonight. Destination? Unknown, but out of state. Once it crosses the state line, it becomes federal, which means slower, which means it doesn't cross, Thales said. He ended the call. Josephine had heard enough of it to understand the shape, if not every detail. He watched her process it from the corner of his eye, the slight shift in her posture, the way her hands pressed harder against her thighs. She was doing the math, assembling the picture. There are others, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. In the same truck? Possibly. Probably. She absorbed that without falling apart. He noted it. A different kind of child would have collapsed at that information, would have needed managing. Josephine Harrison just got quieter and more focused, which was something else entirely. How do you know all of this? She asked. Not accusing. Genuinely asking. How do you have people who just know where trucks have been? Because this city belongs to me, he said simply. Parts of it that don't appear on any map. She considered that. Are you a bad man? The question landed without preamble. The way only children's questions did, no social cushioning, no diplomatic approach, just the thing itself, delivered directly and waiting for an answer. Thales was quiet for a moment. I'm a precise one, he said finally. She seemed to weigh that. Okay, she said, and that was apparently enough for her. What she didn't know, what he had no intention of telling a 10-year-old in a rain-soaked passenger seat, was that the precision she was now depending on had not always been a choice. It had been a survival mechanism, developed in the aftermath of something he had never fully metabolized and never fully escaped. His brother Matteo had been 17. Thales had been 22, already building the foundations of what would eventually become an empire, already learning the geometry of power, already convinced that if you were smart enough and fast enough and ruthless enough, you could control outcomes, could position yourself on the right side of whatever was coming before it arrived. He had been wrong once, just once. Matteo had gotten caught in the crossfire of a territorial dispute that Thales had miscalculated by 48 hours. By the time he arrived at the location, the situation had already resolved itself in the worst possible direction. He had stood in that doorway and understood, with perfect clarity, that his precision had a ceiling he hadn't known existed. He had rebuilt everything after that. Tighter, deeper, more layered. No more 48-hour miscalculations. But Matteo had stayed exactly where he was, in that doorway. Not this time, Thales said quietly. Josephine looked at him. What? Nothing. His phone lit up. Reza's name, he answered. We have the truck. FDR southbound, just past 42nd, moving toward the industrial corridor. Duke, there are multiple heat signatures in the back. At least 4, maybe 5. Thales pressed the accelerator. The city blurred past the windows, steel and glass, and 10 million people living their evening completely unaware that something irreversible was being decided in the rain-soaked dark between one exit and the next. Tell the others to hold position, Thales said. Nothing moves until I'm in front of it. Because this was his territory, and territory meant responsibility. It always had. The FDR drive at evening rush was its own kind of chaos. Headlights smeared across wet asphalt in long amber trails. Brake lights pulsed in clusters like something breathing. The East River ran black and restless to the right, invisible beyond the guardrails, making itself known only in the particular cold that came off it, the kind that moved through glass and clothing and settled in the chest. Thales entered the southbound lane at 57th and immediately saw the truck. 4 cars ahead, moving at the pace of traffic, unhurried, disciplined. Whoever was driving it had done this before. No aggressive lane changes, no unnecessary acceleration. Just a vehicle moving with the city, invisible in the way that deliberate normalcy made things invisible. That was the tell, actually. In Thales's experience, guilt moved one of 2 ways, too fast or too carefully. Panic chose speed. Calculation chose the speed limit, used the turn signal, let the car in front merge without incident. The truck was doing everything right, which meant the person behind the wheel had been trained to understand that the most dangerous thing you could do when carrying something you shouldn't be carrying was to give anyone a reason to look at you. He knew that logic intimately. He had written the version of it that applied to half this city. Is that it? Josephine leaned forward against the seatbelt, both hands on the dashboard. Is that the truck? Sit back. But is it? Josephine. She sat back. Barely. The taillight, she said, her voice dropping to something controlled and focused. The right one. Can you see it from here? He could. Through the rain and the distance and the shifting bodies of vehicles between them, he could see the right rear of the truck and the tail light that pulsed slightly wrong, slightly dim, like something flickering at the edge of failure. Cracked. Exactly as she'd described. He said nothing. But something in his jaw settled. He made the call to Reza with 3 words. We have visual. Then he moved the sedan 2 lanes left, creating an angle. Not closing the distance, not yet. The worst thing he could do was spook the driver before his men had sealed the exits at the corridor end. A panicked driver on a rain-slick highway with children in the back was a problem that didn't resolve cleanly in anyone's favor. So he matched pace. He watched. He waited. This was the part most men couldn't do, the waiting after the decision had already been made. Action without patience was just reaction with better vocabulary. Thales had learned early that the most powerful position in any confrontation was the one the other person didn't know you occupied. The truck didn't know it was already caught. It was still pretending to be invisible. Then everything changed. The driver's side mirror of the truck angled barely, almost imperceptibly, and Thales caught the moment the angle shifted toward him, toward his sedan. He recognized the quality of that particular adjustment. That wasn't a driver checking his blind spot. That was a driver who had seen something that made him look twice. Hold on, Thales said. What's hap? The truck lurched. Not a gradual acceleration, a lurch, sudden and violent, the rear end swinging slightly as the driver overcorrected on the wet surface. It cut hard across 2 lanes, horns erupting immediately from the vehicles it displaced. A silver SUV hit its brakes and fishtailed. A yellow cab swerved toward the shoulder. The truck was running. Thales responded without urgency, which looked from the outside like calm, and was actually something more precise than calm. It was the elimination of every response that wouldn't work, leaving only the one that would. He crossed 2 lanes in a single fluid movement, staying wide enough to avoid the chaos the truck had left behind, close enough to maintain visual. You said they can't know we're following, Josephine said, her voice taut. You said that on the phone. They already know. So what does that mean? It means we stop managing the approach and start managing the exit. He called Reza. Driver's spooked. He's pushing south. Is the corridor sealed? North end, yes. South end, 2 minutes. Make it 1. The truck hit the 34th Street interchange, doing 15 over the limit, weaving with the particular desperation of someone who knew the geography and was trying to use it. Thales stayed with it, not matching every maneuver, but reading them, predicting the next one before it happened, the way you read a sentence ahead when you already knew the language. Left toward the off-ramp, corrected back. Right toward the barrier, corrected back. The driver was good. But he was reacting. Thales was deciding. He's going for the industrial corridor, Thales said. He thinks there's an exit there. Is there? There was. The truck made a hard right off the FDR, onto a service road that ran parallel to the river. The road narrowed immediately, concrete barriers on both sides, warehouses rising in dark blocks to the left, the river a black absence to the right, overhead lighting sparse and inconsistent, pools of yellow dissolving into long stretches of dark. The truck accelerated into the corridor. Josephine's hand found the door handle, not to open it, just to hold something solid. Thales noticed. The boys in that truck, she said. Her voice had changed, quieter. Something underneath the fear now, not bravado, not performance, just the voice of someone who had decided something. They're scared. Right now, with everything moving like this, they're scared. Yes, Thales said. "Caleb hates the dark," she said. "He's 12, and he still keeps the hallway light on. He thinks I don't know." Thales said nothing. "Just please don't let it take long." He looked at her once, just once. Then he looked back at the truck, now 200 meters ahead. Brake lights flaring red as it registered what was in front of it, the dark mouths of the industrial corridor. And somewhere beyond them, the thing it hadn't planned for, a wall that hadn't been there before. His phone lit up. "Reza, south end is sealed." Thales exhaled once, controlled and quiet. "The truck is being herded," he said, mostly to himself, but Josephine heard it. And for the first time since she had grabbed a stranger's arm on Lexington Avenue in the rain, something shifted in her chest. Not relief. Not yet, but the first molecule of it. The corridor swallowed them whole. Concrete walls rose on both sides, slick and dark from the rain, covered in the kind of grime that accumulated over decades of industrial indifference. Overhead, a string of sodium lights threw down weak yellow pools that did more to define the darkness between them than to push it back. The river smell was stronger here, salt and rust and cold moving water cutting through the rain with something that felt ancient and indifferent to whatever was about to happen in front of it. The truck's brake lights flared. Not a gradual slowdown. A hard, sudden compression, the kind that happened when a driver registered something ahead that his body understood before his mind caught up. The rear of the truck dipped forward, tires locking briefly against wet concrete before catching, and for one suspended second, the entire vehicle seemed to hover between momentum and stillness. Then it saw what Thales had already known was there. 3 black sedans, positioned across the full width of the corridor in a shallow V formation, headlights burning forward, engines running, making no sound that the rain didn't swallow immediately. They weren't parked. They were placed with the geometric precision of men who had done this before in different corridors in different weather and understood that the psychological architecture of a blockade mattered as much as the physical one. No movement, no visible figures, just 3 vehicles that said, quietly and completely, "This is where it ends." The truck stopped. Thales pulled his sedan to a halt 20 meters behind it, cutting off the retreat that wasn't available anyway. He turned the engine off. In the sudden relative quiet, the rain against the roof of the car became the loudest thing in the world. Josephine was rigid beside him, both hands flat on her thighs again, a posture he had come to recognize as her bracing position, the physical equivalent of holding your breath. "Stay in the car," he said. "Thales." Josephine. The way he said her name was not loud. It contained no threat, no anger, but it occupied the space in the car completely, the way a stone occupied water displacing everything around it. She stayed. He stepped out. The rain hit him immediately cold and sideways, doing nothing for the suit, which he noted and dismissed. He walked forward at the pace of a man crossing a room he owned, because that was precisely the frame of reference he was operating from. This corridor, this city, this moment, his territory. The truck's cab door swung open. The driver dropped to the ground, late 30s, heavy set, a green jacket that Josephine had described with perfect accuracy from 4 blocks, and a rain-blurred block of terror. He landed in a crouch and immediately straightened, reading the blockade ahead, reading Thales behind him, reading the math of the situation in the way guilty people read geography, looking for the exit that wasn't there. He ran left. He made it 6 meters before 2 of Thales' men materialized from the shadow beside the warehouse wall and stopped him with the efficient, practiced minimum of force that said, "We do this regularly, and it doesn't need to be dramatic." It wasn't dramatic. The driver went down, stayed down. A second figure emerged from the passenger side of the truck cab, younger, moving faster, heading right toward the narrow gap between the concrete barrier and the warehouse wall. Thales tracked him without turning, lifted 2 fingers, and the gap closed before the man reached it. Another of his men, positioned exactly there, because Reza had mapped the corridor before the truck entered it and identified every exit a panicked person might attempt. Precision. Thales reached the rear of the truck. The padlock on the cargo doors was a combination model, heavy gauge, commercial grade, the kind that communicated this is serious cargo to anyone who might have looked at it in transit. Thales studied it for 1 second, and then looked left, where one of his men was already approaching with a cutter. He took it, did it himself. The lock gave with a sound that was lost immediately in the rain. He took hold of both door handles. Behind him, he heard the passenger door of his sedan open despite everything he had said. He heard small feet on wet concrete. He didn't turn around. There was no version of this moment where he could have stopped her, and somewhere underneath the protocol and the precision, he understood that stopping her would have been the wrong thing to do anyway. She had earned this. He opened the doors. The darkness inside the truck was dense and specific. The particular dark of an enclosed space with no light source, overlaid with the smell of fear, which was real and had a chemistry to it, something metallic and close. For a moment, nothing moved. The interior resolved itself in the spill of the corridor's weak lighting cardboard on the floor, a tarp pushed to one side, and against the far wall, 5 shapes, boys. Sitting with their backs against the wall, wrists zip-tied in front of them, eyes squinting against even the dim light like it was an assault after whatever darkness they had been sitting in. 5 different faces. 5 different expressions cycling through the same sequence: confusion, then recognition that something had changed, then the fragile, dangerous, desperately careful beginning of hope. Ages 9 to 12. No visible injuries beyond the zip ties cutting into wrists. Terrified in the way that had moved past active terror into the exhausted aftermath of it. Thales scanned them, counting, confirming. Then he heard it behind him. Caleb. Not a scream. Not a cry. Just his name, said in the voice of his sister, said with the particular quality of a word that had been held in the throat for the last 40 minutes, and could finally, be released. One of the 5 boys looked up. Brown coat, blue backpack, broken zipper on the left pocket, still strapped to his shoulders, like he had held onto it through everything, because holding onto it was the only action available to him. His eyes found her. "Joe," he said. The word barely made it out. Josephine was already moving past Thales, into the truck, crossing the distance between them in the way that people cross the distance between themselves and the thing they were most afraid of losing. She dropped to her knees on the cardboard floor and wrapped both arms around her brother's shoulders and held on with the particular ferocity of someone who had told themselves they would not let go again. Caleb pressed his face into her shoulder. His whole body shook once, then twice. Then he cried the completely unguarded, structureless kind that 12-year-old boys only permitted themselves when they had run completely out of the energy required to hold it back. "I knew you'd come," he whispered into her hoodie. Thales stood at the open doors of the truck in the rain. He looked at the 4 other boys already being attended to by his men, zip ties cut, quiet reassurances being offered. He looked at Josephine and Caleb, still holding each other on the floor of a cargo truck in an industrial corridor, while the rain came down outside and the city continued somewhere above them, completely unaware. He had intercepted a truck, but the manifest on the warehouse wall, recovered by Reza's team in the last 6 minutes, told a different story entirely. This wasn't the end. This was the first transfer point, and the pipeline it fed was still running. Reza arrived 11 minutes after the doors opened. He came in a 4th black sedan that rolled to a stop at the corridor entrance with the quiet authority of everything. Thales operated no announcement, no excess, just presence arriving precisely when it was needed. He was lean and unhurried, mid-40s, with the kind of face that had stopped being readable to strangers a long time ago. He moved to Thales immediately, a folded document held flat against his palm. Thales took it without looking at it. He was still watching the truck. His men had helped the 4 other boys out of the cargo hold, cutting zip ties, offering water from the sedan's emergency supply, keeping voices low and movements deliberate in the way you moved around. People whose nervous systems had been running on maximum alert for hours. 2 of the boys hadn't spoken yet. One, the youngest couldn't have been older than 9, had asked for his mother with the particular flatness of a child who had already asked that question many times in the dark and had learned to ask it quietly. One of Thales's men, a broad-shouldered figure named Dex, who had a daughter of his own in the Bronx, sat beside the youngest boy on the corridor floor without being asked, said nothing, just sat there, present. Thales noted it. He finally looked at the document. It was a warehouse manifest. Single page, printed, partially handwritten in the margins. A list of dates, route codes, vehicle reference numbers, and what appeared to be a staging schedule. The language was deliberately obscured numerical codes in place of locations, abbreviations that meant nothing without a key. But Thales didn't need the key. He had been reading the underground language of cargo and routes and staging points for 2 decades. The structure of it was universal, the same way the structure of a sentence was universal regardless of which language filled it in. He read it in 40 seconds. Then he read it again. "How many transfer points?" he asked Reza. 3 confirmed. 1 here which we've now closed. 1 in Newark. 1 we haven't fully identified yet, somewhere along the I-95 corridor. And the final destination? Reza was quiet for a moment in the way that meant the answer was worse than the question had prepared for. 2 possibilities, both out of state, both connected to distribution networks that move people the way other networks move product in bulk, on schedule, with redundancy built in so that losing one transfer point doesn't collapse the operation. Thales folded the manifest once and placed it in his jacket. Ferreira built this, he said. It wasn't a question. Ferreira funded it. The operational architecture belongs to someone further up. He's a node, not the source. Then we don't stop at Ferreira. No, Reza agreed. We don't. Thales turned back to the truck. Josephine and Caleb were still inside it, still on the cardboard floor, still holding each other in the way that people held each other when they had come close enough to permanent loss to feel its temperature. Neither of them was speaking. There was nothing to say that the holding didn't already say more completely. He gave them another minute. Then he stepped up into the cargo hold and crouched to their level, not towering over them, not managing them from a height, but putting himself in the geometry of the conversation rather than above it. It was a thing he rarely did and almost never thought about consciously. He did it now without thinking. Caleb, the boy looked up. Red-eyed, jaw set with the particular determined dignity of a 12-year-old who had decided he was finished crying and was enforcing that decision through sheer will. His wrists were raw where the zip ties had been. Are you injured? No. A pause. My wrists. We'll have that looked at. The other boys are being taken care of. Caleb looked past Thales to where his men were attending to the others. He studied it for a moment, assembling his assessment of the situation the way a 12-year-old who had been paying attention his whole life assembled things. Then something in his shoulders dropped, not collapse, but release. The specific release of a person who has been holding a weight and has finally found somewhere to set it down. There were more, Caleb said quietly. Before us, in here. Thales stilled. What do you mean? When they put me in, there was something on the floor. A shoe, kid's shoe, maybe size 4. And there were marks on the wall. He glanced at the cargo hold wall. Scratch marks, like someone was keeping count. Thales looked at the wall. He hadn't seen it in the first assessment. Now, in the weak light, he could make out the marks, thin lines scored into the metal panel, grouped in sets of 5. 3 complete sets. 3 groups of 5 days, or hours, or something a frightened child had decided to count, because counting was the only form of control available. 15 marks. Thales looked at them for a long moment. Josephine had gone very still beside her brother, her eyes on the wall, doing the same math everyone in the cargo hold was doing. The operation has been running longer than 6 weeks, Thales said. Not to anyone specifically, to the fact of it. At least, Reza said from the doorway of the truck. And the boys in the other cases Queens, Brooklyn. Unknown final status. That's what we don't have yet. Unknown final status. The bureaucratic distance of that phrase and the reality it described existed in the same sentence, and the gap between them was the size of 15 sets of parents who didn't know where their children were tonight. Josephine looked at Thales. Her eyes were dry now. That was the thing about Josephine Harrison. She cycled through her emotions at speed, processed them in real time, and came out the other side still functional and still paying attention. He had noticed it from the beginning, and he noticed it again now. You didn't just stop one truck, she said. No, there are more kids. Yes, so what happens now? Thales stepped down from the cargo hold, stood in the rain, looked down the corridor at the sealed exit, at the blockade still holding its formation, at the driver sitting on the wet concrete with his hands secured behind him. He thought about the manifest in his jacket, the 3 transfer points, the network above Ferreira, the 15 marks on a metal wall, scored by a child who had needed to count something because counting meant time was still passing, and time meant someone might still come. Now, he said, we find out how deep it goes. He looked at Reza. Get the warehouse. Reza was already on the phone before the sentence finished, and the night, which had already been longer than most, was only beginning to show Thales Rios how much further down it intended to go before it let him surface. The warehouse was 12 minutes from the corridor. It sat at the end of a service road that didn't appear on standard navigation, the kind of omission that wasn't accidental, that had been arranged through a combination of outdated mapping data and deliberate misdirection maintained by people who needed certain addresses to remain effectively invisible to anyone not already looking for them specifically. Thales knew it because Reza had found it 6 weeks ago during the initial surveillance of Ferreira's northward expansion. It had been flagged as a secondary concern, a storage facility, probably logistics, probably clean on the surface, They had watched it, noted the irregular vehicle patterns, filed it. They had not yet understood what it was storing. That particular miscalculation had cost 7 boys 6 weeks of nights. Thales drove alone. Josephine and Caleb were in a second sedan with decks, heading to a safe location, a building Thales maintained in Midtown that had served various purposes over the years, and tonight would serve the purpose of 2 children who needed warmth and medical attention for raw wrists, and a 12-year-old who needed to stop being brave for approximately 5 consecutive minutes without an audience. He had told Josephine this. She had not liked it. "I want to come," she said. She was standing outside the corridor sedan, rain-soaked and resolute, her jaw set in the expression he had come to recognize as her version of immovable. "I know," he said. "Caleb needs me. Caleb needs a warm room and someone who isn't running an operation. You can be that person. You cannot be both." She held his gaze for a moment longer than most adults managed. Then she got in the car. He drove. The warehouse resolved itself out of the dark and rain, a low industrial structure, corrugated metal siding, 2 loading bays with shuttered doors, a single office window on the upper level throwing out a bar of light that someone had forgotten to extinguish or hadn't bothered to. Around it, the particular stillness of a place that had learned to look unoccupied. 3 of Thales's vehicles were already positioned in a perimeter when he arrived. Reza's coordination was precise in the way that distinguished a good lieutenant from a great one, not just executing instructions, but anticipating the next requirement before it was voiced. Thales stepped out. He stood in the rain and looked at the building for a long moment. 12 minutes ago he had read a manifest that told him this warehouse was a staging hub, the central node through which Ferreira's pipeline routed its cargo before distribution. The trucks were secondary. The drivers were replaceable. The manifest codes were changeable. But a physical location took time to establish the contacts, the arrangements, the invisible agreements with the people who noticed things in an area and needed to be compensated for not noticing this particular thing. Destroy the location and you didn't just stop tonight's operation. You collapsed months of infrastructure. "How many inside?" he asked Reza. "Thermal shows 4. 2 in the loading bay, 1 in the office, 1 we can't place somewhere in the interior structure. Armed? Assume yes. Exits? Loading bay front, fire door east side, office window upper level, not viable for exit, but someone might try." Thales processed it, mapped the geometry, identified the sequence. Bay and fire door simultaneously. Office last, whoever's up there isn't going anywhere and knows it already. He paused. "No unnecessary escalation. I want them functional enough to answer questions." Reza nodded. Moved. What followed took 4 minutes and 20 seconds. Thales experienced it the way he experienced most operations he had designed, not from the center of the action, but from a position that allowed him to see the whole shape of it. His men moved with the compressed efficiency of people who had worked together long enough that communication had reduced itself to glances and positions, and the shared understanding of a plan executed so many times in similar configurations that improvisation and preparation had become indistinguishable from each other. The loading bay, the fire door. The interior figure who turned out to be asleep in a folding chair behind a stack of pallets and woke to find the situation had resolved entirely without his participation. 4 minutes, 20 seconds, then Thales walked in. The interior of the warehouse was not what the exterior suggested. The loading bay was standard bare concrete, industrial shelving, the detritus of a functioning logistics operation maintained as cover. But through the interior door, the structure changed. The space behind the public-facing architecture was divided makeshift partitions, cot frames bolted to the floor, secured anchor points at regular intervals along the walls. He stood in it. He looked at the anchor points, the cot frames, the partitions constructed for efficient use of floor space in the way that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with capacity. Something cold moved through him. Not surprised he had known what this was from the manifest. But knowing and seeing occupied different rooms in a person's understanding of things, and walking into the second room always cost something that the first room hadn't prepared you for. He turned to the man from the office, brought down now, seated on the floor, back against the wall, processing the rapid deterioration of his evening, with the particular stillness of someone who had decided that cooperation was the only architecture left available to him. Thales crouched in front of him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The warehouse was quiet enough that everything he said arrived with complete clarity. "The pipeline above Ferreira," he said, the name at the top of it, "and the Newark location." The man looked at him. Thales looked back. I'm going to dismantle every piece of this regardless of what you tell me, Thales said. The only variable your cooperation affects is how the next hour feels for you. Choose quickly. I have other things to do tonight. The man chose quickly. The name he gave was one Thales recognized not from direct dealings, but from the periphery of 3 separate conversations over the past year in which it had appeared as background information. Unremarkable, unconnected to anything that had warranted direct attention. Unremarkable, unconnected, the perfect architecture for something that needed not to be seen. Thales stood. He looked at Reza. Accounts, assets, the Newark address, all of it, tonight. And Ferreira? Thales considered. Ferreira had built a layer of a machine designed to move children like freight through a city that had no idea it was happening. He had done it inside territory that Thales had allowed himself to believe was functioning within the understood architecture of things. That miscalculation had a price. Ferreira gets a message, Thales said. Delivered personally. He walked to the warehouse door, stopped, looked back at the interior, the cot frames, the anchor points, the partitions built for capacity. Children, he said quietly, to no one and everyone, are not commerce. Then he walked out into the rain and made the call that began the last chapter of Ferreira's operation. By 3 a.m, the accounts were frozen. By 4, the Newark location was empty and sealed. By sunrise, the pipeline that had moved 7 boys across 3 boroughs in 6 weeks had ceased to exist in any functional form. No sirens had echoed once. The safe house was on the 14th floor. It was not what the word safe house implied to people whose understanding of such things came from films. No exposed brick, no bare bulbs, no maps pinned to walls. It was a clean, well-furnished apartment that Thales maintained under a corporate name that led nowhere interesting if anyone followed it. Warm lighting, a kitchen stocked with things that suggested someone lived there, 2 bedrooms with doors that closed properly, and a living room with tall windows that looked out over Midtown's glittering indifference. Dex had brought Caleb and Josephine here directly from the corridor. A Dr. Thales trusted a quiet, thorough woman named Dr. Osei, who had been treating injuries that couldn't go to hospitals for 11 years, had attended to Caleb's wrists within the first 20 minutes. Light abrasions from the zip ties, no nerve damage, a bruise across his left shoulder from the initial grab. She cleaned everything, wrapped what needed wrapping, left medication on the kitchen counter with written instructions, and departed without asking questions she already knew wouldn't be answered. Caleb was asleep in the first bedroom within an hour. He had resisted that 12-year-old dignity again, insisting he was fine, insisting he didn't need to sleep, insisting with the particular stubbornness of a boy who had spent hours in the dark being afraid and needed to be something other than vulnerable for a while. Then Josephine had sat on the edge of the bed beside him and said nothing, just sat there, and within 10 minutes his breathing had deepened, and his body had made the decision his pride wouldn't. She came back to the living room and sat on the couch. She was still sitting there when Thales arrived. He came in at 2:30 in the morning, suit still immaculate despite everything the night had put it through, the rain, the corridor, the warehouse. He stood in the doorway of the living room and looked at her. She looked back at him. She looked older than 10 in that moment. Not in appearance. Her face was still a child's face, still soft at the edges, still carrying the particular openness of someone who hadn't yet built all their walls. But in the eyes, in the way she was sitting, like someone who had been handed a piece of knowledge about the world that no 10-year-old should have been handed, and had decided to hold it carefully, rather than put it down. He's asleep, she said. Good. The other boys are with their families. He had made those arrangements from the car. Quiet extractions, careful deliveries, no explanations that required more words than necessary. 5 families who would spend the rest of their lives not fully understanding what had happened or who had intervened, which was exactly the intended outcome. Josephine nodded slowly. And the people who took them? No longer a concern. She absorbed that with the same processing speed he had observed all night, taking information in, integrating it, arriving at the next question without excess delay. All of them? All of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, how? Efficiently. She almost smiled. It was the same word he had used hours ago, in a different context, and she had remembered it. He noted that she remembered everything. Sit down, she said. Not a request exactly. More the way a person spoke when they had decided that the conversation they were about to have required a different configuration of the room. He sat, the chair across from the couch. He didn't lean back. He sat the way he always sat, upright, present, with the kind of stillness that in any other context read as controlled, and in this one read as someone who was allowing themselves to be still for the first time in hours. Josephine looked at him steadily. "Why did you help us?" The question arrived simply, the way her questions always arrived, without diplomatic cushioning, without the social scaffolding adults use to soften the approach to things they actually wanted to know. Just the question itself, sitting in the air between them, waiting. Thales was quiet. Not the quiet of evasion, the quiet of a man accessing something he did not regularly access in company, the room inside himself where the actual answers lived, behind the architecture of precision and control, and the cultivated reputation that had kept him alive and operational for 20 years. He looked at his hands, the ink on his knuckles, the faint line of a scar along his right thumb that was old enough now that most days he forgot it was there. "I had a brother," he said. Josephine didn't move, didn't speak. "Matteo. He was 17. He said the name the way you said the names of people you had been carrying for a long time carefully, like the name itself was something that could be worn down by careless handling. He was loud, impossible, argued about everything, ate everything in the apartment, and blamed it on everyone else. Something crossed his face. Brief. Real. He was 17 and I was 22, and I believed that being smart enough and fast enough meant I could control outcomes, that I could position myself ahead of whatever was coming before it arrived." He stopped. "I was wrong once." The apartment was very quiet. Outside the tall windows, Manhattan continued its restless, sleepless operation. Lights moving, sirens distant, the city that never acknowledged what happened in its own dark corridors. He got caught in something I had miscalculated by 2 days. When I arrived, he stopped again. He was already gone. Josephine was watching him with the complete, unguarded attention that children brought to things that mattered, no performance of listening, just listening itself. "I rebuilt everything after that," Thales said. "Tighter, deeper. No more miscalculations, no more 2-day errors." A pause. But Matteo stayed exactly where he was, in that doorway. "I carry him there." He looked up at her. "When you grabbed my arm when you said your brother was in that truck." He let the sentence find its own ending. "I saw what real loss looked like in the half-second before it happened, and I had already lived on the other side of that half-second for 15 years. So you stopped?" Josephine said softly. "So I stopped." She was quiet for a long moment. Her hands, folded in her lap, tightened slightly and released. "I let go of his sleeve," she said, "to fix my shoe. That's why they got him." "Josephine." "I know it's not my fault," she said quickly. "I know that, logically." A pause. "But I keep seeing him look back at me." "You'll keep seeing it for a while," Thales said. "That's honest. Anyone who tells you otherwise is offering you comfort instead of truth." She looked at him. "But here is also true you saw the taillight, the scratched door, the painted logo, the radio on his belt. You remembered every detail under terror, and then you found the one person in that city willing to act on what you told them." He held her gaze. "You didn't save your brother despite letting go of his sleeve. You saved your brother because of everything you did after." She looked at him for a long time. Then she stood up from the couch, crossed the space between them, and wrapped both arms around him, her head against his shoulder, her thin arms reaching as far as they could reach. He went very still. Then, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man performing an action he had not performed in a very long time, he placed one hand against the back of her head. They stayed like that for a moment that the rest of the night had no jurisdiction over. When she finally stepped back, she wiped her face once with the back of her hand and straightened, reassembling that particular Josephine Harrison composure, the one that arrived after the emotion, rather than instead of it. "Matteo would have liked you," Thales said quietly. She looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because he liked people who didn't quit." She almost smiled again. This time it made it all the way. The city moved the way it always moved. Without acknowledgement. Without pause. Without any visible memory of what had happened in its corridors and service roads and industrial edges over the course of one rain-soaked October night. Manhattan's particular genius was its capacity for forward momentum, the way it metabolized events that would have defined smaller places and converted them immediately into the next moment, the next block, the next thing requiring attention. 5 families had been returned to themselves. A pipeline that had operated across 3 boroughs for the better part of 2 months had been dismantled in a single night, its infrastructure frozen, its personnel removed from operation, its physical locations emptied and sealed before the city's legitimate authorities had any occasion to notice anything requiring their involvement. No sirens had echoed. No press conference had been convened. No headline had captured what had happened in the rain on the FDR Drive, or in the industrial corridor, or in the warehouse with the cot frames bolted to the floor. The city simply didn't know. And the city's not knowing was, in this particular instance, exactly correct. Thales stood at the window of his office on a Tuesday morning, with coffee he hadn't touched, and looked at the street below. Not Lexington, a different block. Quieter, lined with the kind of architecture that had survived long enough to look permanent. His office occupied the upper floor of a building that appeared to house a private equity consultancy to anyone who looked at the lobby directory. The consultancy was real. It was simply not the primary function of the floors above it. He had been in this office by 7. He was always in this office by 7. He had reviewed the aftermath of the night's operations in the 2 weeks since they had concluded. Reza's full report thorough, precise, delivered without editorial. The Newark location had been clean before federal surveillance had any occasion to look at it. Ferreira had received his message in the way that Thales delivered messages that needed to be remembered clearly, personally, and with enough specificity that the content would not require repetition. Ferreira would not expand north again. The name above Ferreira in the pipeline's architecture, the source Reza had identified through the warehouse's digital records, and the information provided by the man from the office had been passed to a contact Thales maintained inside a federal task force, not through official channels, through the kind of channel that produced results, without requiring explanations of how the information had been obtained. That investigation was ongoing, moving at the pace of legitimate systems, which was slower than Thales preferred but permanent, in a way that his own methods could not be. Some things required the architecture of law to hold properly. He had learned that distinction over time. His phone sat on the desk behind him. He was not looking at it. He was looking at the street, at the Tuesday morning movement of people who had somewhere to be, and were moving toward it with the focused momentum of lives organized around appointment and routine. He thought about Josephine. He had arranged for the Harrison family to be moved to a safer building, a better neighborhood, a better school, the kind of quiet, logistical rearrangement that cost him nothing, and cost them the vulnerability that had made them visible to the wrong people. Their mother, a woman named Patricia Harrison, who worked double shifts at a hospital and came home to 2 children. She was raising alone with the specific, exhausted love of someone who had decided that exhaustion was not an acceptable reason to do less. Then everything Patricia had received an envelope, 2 days after the night in question, containing a lease agreement for the new apartment and a 1-year receipt marked paid. She had called the number on the envelope. No one had answered. She had moved her children anyway. Sometimes clarity of intention communicated itself without requiring explanation. He heard the door behind him. Reza, entering with the particular knock that was functionally not a knock, a single tap that said, "I'm coming in," rather than "may I." "There's a delivery," Reza said. "Personal. Left at the front desk downstairs. No sender identification." Thales turned from the window. Reza placed a small envelope on the desk. Plain white. His name on the front in handwriting that was careful and slightly uneven, the handwriting of someone young who was trying to write neatly and was almost achieving it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he sat down, picked it up, and opened it. Inside was a photograph, printed on standard photo paper, the edges slightly imprecise in the way home printers produce them. It showed 2 children on what appeared to be a school step afternoon light, concrete, a row of metal lockers visible through a glass door behind them. The boy was taller than the girl, brown coat, blue backpack. He was laughing at something outside the frame, his head turned slightly, completely unguarded in the way that people were when they didn't know a picture was being taken. The girl was looking directly at the camera. Gray hoodie, straight brown hair, eyes that held, even in a still photograph, the quality he had identified on a rain-soaked sidewalk alert, direct, missing nothing. She was smiling. Not performing a smile. Actually smiling, the way Thales had seen her almost smile twice during the night, and had understood each time that the full version of it would be something significant. It was. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in the same careful handwriting. "You listened." 2 words. He sat with them for a moment that had no particular duration. Then he did something he had not done with a piece of paper in longer than he could accurately place. He did not file it, did not pass it to Reza, did not process it as information requiring a response. He opened the inner breast pocket of his suit jacket, placed the photograph inside, against the left side, over the heart, as these things were placed when they were meant to stay. He closed the pocket, picked up his coffee, found it cold, set it back down. Outside, Tuesday morning continued its indifferent, magnificent forward movement. The city that had no idea what had been done inside it, and for it, on one October night in the rain. Reza, still standing at the door, looked at Thales's expression and decided, with the wisdom of a man who had worked alongside him for 12 years, that this particular moment did not require a question. He left quietly. Thales sat alone in his office with the photograph over his heart, and the coffee going cold on the desk, and the Tuesday light coming through the window, and for a sustained, unscheduled, entirely uncharacteristic moment he let himself be still, not controlled, not strategic, not precise. Just still. It was raining again. October had become November without particular ceremony. The way months changed in cities not felt as a transition but discovered in retrospect. The realization arriving only when you noticed the quality of light had shifted, and the cold had found a new register that it hadn't occupied the week before. Thales walked Lexington Avenue alone. No sedan, no Reza at a parallel distance, no men positioned at the corner he was approaching, just himself, in the black suit, collar open, moving at the pace of a man who had decided that this particular evening required the experience of the city at ground level, its noise and movement, and complete indifference pressing against him from all sides the way it pressed against everyone else. He had done this perhaps 4 times in the past decade, walked without the architecture of security and distance and managed approach that normally surrounded him. Each time had been deliberate. Each time had followed something that required processing in a way that the controlled environment of his office and his vehicles and his maintained perimeters did not permit. He reached 68th Street. He stopped. The delivery entrance was on the left, the same brick wall, the same narrow alley mouth, the same unremarkable functional architecture that had been the backdrop for the moment everything began. In the daylight, on a different day, it would have been invisible. The kind of urban detail you passed 1,000 times without registering. He registered it now. He stood on the sidewalk in the rain and looked at the alley and thought about a 12-year-old boy being walked through it by a man in a green jacket while his sister watched from 4 steps behind. He thought about the particular geometry of that, the 4 steps, the shoe, the sleeve released, the difference between being there and not being there, measured in the length of time it took to fix a shoe. The city moved around him. Umbrellas, taxis, a food cart vendor, a different one from that evening, or possibly the same one. It was impossible to know. Wrapping something in foil, with the efficiency of a person who had performed that action 10,000 times. Pedestrians moving with the forward-only momentum of people who had somewhere to be. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked at him. He was, from the outside, simply a tall man in a black suit standing still on a busy sidewalk in the rain, which was eccentric but not remarkable. Manhattan had a high threshold for eccentricity, and an even higher one for standing still on sidewalks. He thought about what Josephine had said in the corridor. You didn't just stop one truck. The way she had said it not with wonder, but with the factual, integrating tone of someone updating their understanding of the scale of a thing, processing upward rather than shutting down. He thought about Caleb's voice. I knew you'd come, said to his sister, not to Thales, and that was exactly right, exactly correct, because Josephine was the one who had come. Thales had simply been the instrument she'd found to come with. He thought about the photograph in his breast pocket. You listened. He had been listening to this city for 20 years, to its invisible frequencies, the routes and arrangements and pressures and fault lines that existed beneath the surface, that most people walked across, without knowing it was a surface at all. He had built his entire architecture on that listening, on the belief that information was power, and power was survival, and survival was the only goal that mattered. He had listened for 20 years to everything that served the architecture. On one October evening, a 10-year-old girl in a gray hoodie had grabbed his arm, and he had listened to something different. Something small and terrified and completely without leverage, no information to trade, no power to offer, no position in any arrangement that made her worth listening to by any calculation his empire ran on. He had listened anyway, and in doing so, had discovered a miscalculation that his architecture had been quietly sustaining the belief that territory meant control, when what it actually meant, when you stripped it down to its honest foundation, was responsibility. Control was what you held over things. Responsibility was what you held for them. The distinction had existed his entire career. He had simply required a 10-year-old to show him where it lived. He reached into his breast pocket, touched the edge of the photograph without removing it. The paper slightly curved now from the warmth of being carried there. You listened. The city feared Thales Rios. It feared him for the usual reasons that cities feared men like him. The precision, the reach, the consequences that followed certain actions, the silence that surrounded him. That was not the silence of absence, but the silence of everything already decided. Those reasons were real, and they were not going away, and he had no particular interest in their going away, because the fear served functions that the fear had always served, and the world he operated in was not a world that rewarded the removal of your own teeth. He was still that man. He would be that man tomorrow, and the day after, and in every room where it was required. But somewhere in the city tonight, 2 children were asleep in an apartment in a better building than they had lived in a month ago, in a school district that would serve them better than the one before it, in a life that had continued when it had been scheduled, by people who treated children as cargo, to be interrupted permanently. They were asleep because Josephine Harrison had refused to stop asking, because she had found him on this street, in this rain, and had grabbed his arm with both hands and refused to let go. He looked at the alley one final moment. Then he turned and walked back into the city, back into its noise and movement and magnificent indifference, back into the life that the city feared and respected and had no complete understanding of. The rain fell on him the way it fell on everyone else. He let it. Somewhere in the architecture of what he was, beneath the precision, beneath the reputation, beneath 20 years of decisions made in the dark corners of a city that never acknowledged them in the light, something had quietly, permanently rearranged itself. Not softened, not diminished. Rearranged. The most dangerous man on Lexington Avenue walked north through the rain, and somewhere, 5 families slept. Thanks for sticking with this story until the very end. You're the reason these stories feel alive. If you're ready for another powerful journey, just tap the next video on your screen. And before you go, leave a quick comment and rate this story from 1 to 10. I'm excited to read your thoughts and connect with you in the comments.